So our moderator today is Connie Maxwell. She'll introduce our panelists, and also she has a bit of an introduction about her work. So without going into too much detail, I can say that Connie got a master's in community and regional planning from the University of New Mexico, and now she's working on her PhD in water science and management from New Mexico State University. And we're really happy to have you lead this panel, Connie. So take it away.
Thanks very much, Sam. We've got a great panel today with several people highlighting some important initiatives around the state. And as Sam mentioned, I wanted to just begin with a short introduction on some of the work that we've been doing down here at the New Mexico Water Resources Research Institute in southern New Mexico, and the work that really is central to what I've been focusing on. As a water professional. A key recognition that has been central to this work is that agricultural communities and working landscapes are key to managing our watersheds for sustainability and community resilience. And this is particularly true. You can see the Hatch and Mesilla Valley watersheds down here in southern New Mexico. This led us to instigate a relatively recently formed Water and Community Collaboration Lab. We recognize that collaboration is really central to research on complex issues of water in New Mexico. The WCC Lab fosters links between the best science, community, stakeholders, and students to inform our decision-making, research, and education on water and the environment. The goal of our work is to be led by the challenges that communities actually face. This is an action research approach where we collaboratively develop and test innovative and feasible approaches to the complex issues of water supply and usage in New Mexico. A key insight to this action research approach is that complex systems like ecosystems require implementing proposed changes and studying the effects to reveal how the systems actually work. An early proponent of action research, Libbin, said, if you want to know how things really work, just try to change them. So what are the problems? What underlies the problems that folks down here in southern New Mexico are facing? And this is a key insight to that. What underlies both drought and increased flooding as social crises is really a landscape scale water storage problem. Of course, we have the diminished snowpacks and resulting spring runoff from less winter precipitation as a huge driving factor in droughts for our surface water supply for our southern New Mexico region. But not only that, we have a large decrease in upland soil moisture levels, which has led to loss of vegetation. And this increases our scouring floods. It further decreases infiltration, soil moisture levels, and downstream groundwater recharge. So what is key to turning this around? A central part of this is recognizing that agriculture is the primary land management system, and management practices that slow and spread flow to floodplains supports our watershed's buffering capacity to mitigate floods and droughts. These reconnecting floodplain management practices replenish soil moisture and aquifers, reduce runoff, flow energy, and sediment transport. And so a big goal of my work in particular has been to support increasing agricultural function as a resilient system for recharge and flood control. Farmers and ranchers down here, but also foresters in other parts of the state, manage the floodplains where the water flows in the watersheds and have incentives to manage that, to use water where it can spread flow and so forth. And so two of the gaps that have been particularly looming in our southern New Mexico community have been tools to help folks manage, land managers and water managers actually institute some of these practices. And this has been a focus in my PhD work, developing a decision support tool that says, where do we reconnect floodplains and how much benefit are you going to get out of that practice? So this particular tool, it's a modeling framework. We call it the Flood Flow Connectivity to Landscapes FlowCon model. It identifies the optimal areas for infiltration and then estimates the actual benefits. How much peak flow can we really reduce? And therefore, we predict the connectivity management benefits. But this is only, of course, tools are only part of it. And extending projects on a whole range of fronts is really critical. And so we've been instrumental in facilitating, pursuing funding efforts. And in southern New Mexico, we've been particularly successful over the last year. We've secured 4 funding efforts. 2 of them address issues in our most significant priority project, the Rincon Arroyo Watershed. And 2 of them address areas throughout the Hatch and Mesilla Valley. Zach Libbin will be speaking about these initiatives in greater detail. Our collaboration has been fundamentally with the stakeholders in the Stormwater Coalition, and he'll let you know who those are. But our 2 initiatives in our priority watershed, the Rincon Arroyo Watershed, will enable us to implement watershed restoration with the NMED Watershed Implementation Grant, and us at the Institute were the primary recipient. But we also have secured the first phase of a relatively large NRCS grant that aims to restore the entire Rincon Arroyo watershed. It's 134 square miles. And then in addition to that, we have on our going forward over the next 2 years, we will be completing a watershed plan with the Reclamation Cooperative Watershed Management Program for the whole Hatch and Mesilla Valley. And EBID led an effort to implement watershed scale stormwater monitoring capture to extend their aquifer recharge program. And us at the Institute, we will be adapting some of our tools to look at the future scenarios of this region, particularly what can watershed scale stormwater monitoring and capture do for us, but what are the other water future scenarios? So that gives you a little bit of an intro to our approach as water professionals down here in southern New Mexico, in particular, my approach. And I'm looking forward to hearing about an update to other initiatives around the state. And first, we're going to have Laura McCarthy speak. I am going to let you know that she is the New Mexico State Forester, and she was integral to an initiative that Collin Haffey will be describing from when she was at the Nature Conservancy. But I also would like to ask Laura to give a little bit more of an introduction about yourself that you think is relevant. So take it away, Laura.
Okay, so you can hopefully see the screen now.
Yes.
And yeah, thank you. I'm Laura McCarthy, and I guess by way of furthering the introduction of myself, I'll say that I appreciate that a forester can be invited to present at a water meeting. And I think I'll leave it at that. So I'm going to cover our new forest action plan for the entire state, and also the Forest and Watershed Restoration Act that was passed in 2019 and implemented in 2020, so just last year. Let's make sure that these advance. Are you seeing a second image?
Yes.
Okay, good. All right, so our State Forest Action Plan is required by the federal government in order for the state to receive about $9 million a year of federal funding, but it's also a really important tool for us to come together on a multi-agency and multi-stakeholder basis to set goals and objectives for a 10-year period. And so I'm not going to cover all of the plan, but I am going to focus on 3 strategies that are particularly relevant to watershed restoration. And I'm also going to dive into the interactive priority map that are based on the assessment. And all of this is available by doing just a Google search on NM Forest Action Plan and then clicking on the version that says final draft. And it's final draft because we are waiting for USDA final approval. So 2 maps going on here. On the left is fire risk to communities, with the darkest red being the highest level of risk. And on the right is a composite map from all of the assessment in all of the data in our assessment that really serves as the statewide blueprint for what are the most important watersheds for us to treat. And you can see the little tiny watershed delineations. These are Huck 12 watersheds. You can see also the correlation between the priorities and the fire risk, but I also want you to see that we did intensive mapping of water. And the way that we mapped the water was either if a watershed was either supplying water directly to communities, municipalities, mutual domestics, or any kind of agriculture, and as well, if a watershed was providing water to people downstream. And that was kind of a different way of going about the setting of priorities, but I think it did really accurately capture what's important to New Mexico. And then you can see in our statewide all priorities map that we've added in bosque and riparian restoration. We have 10 strategies, as I mentioned, and the first one that I wanted to cover was restoring forests and watersheds. And, you know, this gets talked about a lot. What I really want to call attention to is number 1, which is really about the scale of it at which we go about restoring watersheds. And small work is good and small work adds up, but it's really important that if we're going to make a difference in terms of watershed restoration, that we go big. And that means setting priorities and focusing on an area until it's finished, and then moving on to the next priority. Also want to draw attention to 1.5, which is about riparian restoration, which I know is really important to a lot of people attending. And this is one of the first times that we've called this out in the statewide forest action plan. The second strategy is fire management. And what I want to focus on in particular, not just how we respond to fire, but our proactive work in prescribed fire. And we had a memorial in 2019, House Memorial 42, that had us and a big stakeholder group look at expanding the use of prescribed fire in our state. It culminated in a report that was shared at a Water and Natural Resources Interim Committee meeting in July, and now it looks like we'll be having some legislation to introduce to create a prescribed fire act for New Mexico that makes it much more possible for private lands and state lands to have prescribed fire, which is a key at getting, it actually ties to our forest management strategy because prescribed fire enables us to get to scale a lot faster. And then the third of our 10 strategies that I wanted to draw attention to is reforestation. And we have increasingly a large backlog of burned lands that are contributing sediment to downstream water users, degrading water quality, but also are not properly storing water in headwater areas. And reforestation is very challenging. It's complex, as you can see in items 1 through 6 here. And we're really far away from having the infrastructure and the the best practices that we need to basically reforest burned areas that are a super harsh environment now, and make sure that the trees that if we are lucky enough to get them to survive in that burned environment, that they also are able to withstand the climate that we expect to have in the year 2100. So this reforestation strategy is very new. It's cutting edge, and it's going to be a really difficult challenge, but I hope that we're successful and that you hear a lot about it in the coming years. Okay, this was just to kind of re-show the priorities, and just want to get this image in your minds, and then switch to the Forest and Watershed Restoration Act of 2019. And this was a multi-year effort to get this legislation passed, and a lot of groups and organizations contributed, and it is a recurring funding source for forest and watershed restoration, with the funding taken out of two existing funds that are commonly used for water infrastructure and that are derived from the Land Grant Permanent Fund. And the Act set up an advisory committee that is comprised of 9 agencies, or 6 agencies and 3 public members, that includes the Office of the State Engineer and the Environment Department, among others, and also includes a public member representing a water interest. And it's been a really interesting learning experience to figure out how this advisory board needs to work together in order to come up with, or in order to review and approve projects for watershed restoration funding. So we've been through one cycle, and we have one more cycle in process. And we are funding a whole range of different types of activities, primarily treatments, but the way the law was written, it can also be used for planning, such as, for example, the Upper Rio Chama watershed was successful in getting funding for the Upper Watershed Plan. And we have an economic development project in Taos County that's about wood utilization, but all of it in the service of accelerating the pace and scale of watershed restoration. So I'm going to end with a call to action. It's really important that forest and water, people who work in water and people who work in forests have time to communicate with one another. And my call to action is that really for anyone who cares about water security to get involved in large-scale forest and watershed restoration project planning. You know, we have these funding streams, we have our planning goals, we know where our priority places are, and we need the engagement really of all different interests in order to come up with the best possible projects. And this was driven home to me yesterday. Rebecca Roos, who is presenting later today and is one of our advisory board members for the Forest and Watershed Restoration Act, sent along a little synopsis of a study by Utah State University about the Colorado River with a water supply variability focus. And the two findings were just so relevant. One is that larger wildfires are correlated with river flows, low river flows. And two, that this tight relationship between river water supply and soil conditions is a predictor of wildfire. So, I mean, what we already intuitively knew, it's all interlinked, and we need to put as much focus on the water-forest link as we possibly can in order to ensure resilient water supplies for the future.
Terrific. do we want to take questions now, or can we wait to the end? We end at 1:45. And this is a question for you, Laura.
Yeah, if it were possible to take questions now, that would be better. I'm going to jump off at 1:30.
1:30, that's it. Yeah, so can you see, Norm Gaum says, great presentation, Laura. And does anybody have any questions? And feel free to unmute yourself in this particular setting, or put it in the chat.
And I will definitely, in the chat, put the link to the Forest Action Plan so you can take a look at it.
That's terrific. One question I have. So I know, and this is something that I've seen addressed in the Rio Grande Water Fund previously, in terms of priority areas for wildfires. But if a community wants to become part of the forestry restoration plans, obviously you look first to the priority areas, but is there another parallel process that one could instigate conversations about particular issues? Do you have a means of collecting impacts throughout the state on folks that have, let's say, allotments, or I forget what you call it, leases within the forest itself?
Yeah, well, there are multiple ways of going about it, but what I would recommend is either engaging with a local soil and water conservation district, or our agency, the New Mexico Forestry Division within Energy, Minerals, and Natural Resources Department. We have 6 district offices, so the entire state is, everybody's in one of our districts. And each of those offices has a district forester who's has many responsibilities, but one of them is direct engagement in collaborative groups. And so I think, and those two, whether you go through the forestry division and our district office, or you go through a soil and water conservation district, they are talking to each other constantly. So 2 roads that lead to the same destination.
Terrific. And then there is another quick question. How can forestry students become involved? Some of what you said applies to that, but I'm sure there's some specific opportunities for interns and.
Yeah, well, first of all, we're at a unique point where we have a number of job opportunities. So if you are interested in a forestry job, please check the State Personnel Office website and do a search for the word forest, and a number of jobs will come up. Some of them are entry level, and we need great people in our agency. So please consider that. As well, getting involved in collaboratives. Those are great places to get ideas for projects that you could do as part of your student activity, and get credit for potentially, but also be contributing to something real in a place that's important to you. And then thirdly, we hire a number of seasonal or emergency wildland firefighters. And while the season is wrapping up now, thank goodness, that'll be starting again in February or March. And that's intermittent work that we'd love, is great for students.
Terrific. We do have one more question, but we do need to move on. It's in the chat itself. Let's see if we can just address it really quickly. Our ranch in the Galinas Canyon has a large spring in Spring Creek that runs into the Galinas River, the watershed for Las Vegas, New Mexico. Are you aware of the in-stream use leases that have recently been established? Is there funding for private landowners to help restore their watershed? And once again, if you could just address that briefly.
Yeah, I'm just going to address the second part, which is the funding for private landowners, because that's more in our area of expertise. And yes, that would be a great reason to contact the district forester because of that 9 million of federal funds that comes to our agency, 6 million a year of it is getting passed out to private landowners. So if you're not taking advantage of that, you might be missing out. And as well, they're aware of a number of other funding sources, whether they come from NRCS or, well, there's just a whole range of options. And so talking to the district forester is like talking with an expert who will be able to help match what you want to do with your land and how you want to contribute to your watershed restoration and help you get matched to the right funding source.
Great. Thank you so much, Laura. Our next speaker is Collin Haffey from the Nature Conservancy. He's a conservation coordinator and he's a leader for the Rio Grande Water Fund. And Collin, I would like to ask you as well to, like your Patagonia hat, very cool, to give a little bit more of an introduction to yourself, what you think is important.
Sure. Thank you. Thanks for the invitation. Yeah, it's a mess under here. So one of the consequences of COVID, right, is very infrequent haircuts. So anyways, yeah, I'm Collin Haffey. I've been working with the Nature Conservancy for 3 years now and had the pleasure of working with Laura for about 18 months, so about half of the time, and really learned a lot from her, and feel similarly that it's always nice when the forestry and fire folks get involved in the water conferences, because really every time I'm out in New Mexico, you know, enjoying our beautiful waterways, I'm always thinking about the forests that they're connected to and the interplay between watersheds, you know, that forests and watershed health all come together in clean, fresh water. And, you know, a little bit of background just to talk about the history, our forests used to look more like this, kept open by frequent low severity fires that have been suppressed pretty significantly and pretty successfully over about the past 100 years. And so now most of us have grown up in New Mexico with forests that look a lot more like this, with fewer big trees and a lot of smaller trees. And these are the trees that are part of the restoration programs that Laura mentioned. And some of the work that we do is removing some of these trees. But because of our successful century of fire exclusion and fire suppression, we've actually built up so much fuel in the system that now our forests are becoming sort of traps, and we're not able to suppress the types of fire that are burning. And in 2020 was a pretty great example of what happens when, as the saying goes, nature bats last. And we've seen massive fires in Colorado, California, Washington, Oregon, and New Mexico was luckily somewhat spared from any sort of catastrophic fire, but we definitely felt the effects of the smoke all summer from the fires in neighboring states and across the West. And so really sends home the issue, like Laura talked about, that this is really a national issue and not just an issue for the state or programs like the Water Fund. And the science, as Laura talked about, in the tight connection between forests, fire, and water, there's a tight connection between forest, fire, and climate. And as the climate has continued to warm since the 80s, and the fuels, the trees have continued to build up, we've seen almost an 8-fold increase in high severity fire. So this is just tree killing fire, the kind of fire that's often devastating to our watersheds. So we've seen this increase in just the past 30 years or so. And we've also, so this is across the entire West. And We've seen this locally too. So here's the Jemez Mountains with the outline of Bandelier National Monument with the Rio Grande running down the right side of the image. And this again just shows the high severity fire. So the tree killing fire of the 70s, the tree killing fire of the 90s, the tree killing fire of the early 2000s, and then the tree killing fire of the 2010s. So we've seen this increase in local, both in the regional and the kind of in the local patterning. And if we look just at the Las Conchas fire from 2011, we can see that this high severity fire devastated entire watersheds from the top of the mountain to the Rio Grande discharge, and that created a lot of post-fire flooding and really degraded water quality. So what's the solution? And because of this tight connection between forest fire and water, the solution really isn't all that complicated. It's easy enough even for a pretty simple-minded forestry guy like me to understand. We need more good fire, we need less bad fire. So we need more of the fire that's rejuvenating and recycles nutrients and retains big, tall trees. And we need less of the fire that kills trees and devastates watersheds and causes the kind of flooding. And so the question is kind of how do we do that? And we do that in a few different ways, both using mechanical treatment similar to the techniques that Laura described and the strategies outlined in the forest action plan. But we've done that. We've employed those tactics across the landscape, and we've seen success. And so here's just one anecdote out of the Santa Fe National Forest, the Venado fire of a few years ago. The area in black there is untreated, so without any sort of forest restoration work. And the yellow is areas that hadn't been burned yet. And then the blue area shows where the high severity fire made a crown fire run, and it stopped in its tracks once it hit that area where fire had been restored. So this demonstrates to me the real importance of making sure that fire is back into our forests in a good way, that healthy fire. So it demonstrates the kind of the good versus the bad fire and the effects of those. So the question, as Laura talked about, one of the ways that we get more of this forest restoration on the ground is actually to find different ways to pay for it. And Laura outlined one in the Forest and Watershed Restoration Act, and I'm going to talk about two more examples from the Rio Grande watershed. And one is an early pilot project of the Santa Fe municipal watershed where water user money went to pay for forest restoration in the municipal watershed. And then through Laura's leadership, but also through the Nature Conservancy and our programs worldwide, we expanded that model to include the entire Rio Grande upper basin and provide water for 1 million people in the downstream communities, both rural communities and then the Albuquerque. But also along the way, this clean water is feeding acequias and small farms and then the Middle Rio Grande agricultural district. So incredibly important work, and that connection is really strong. And we've been able to use the funding from some of our downstream water users, particularly the Albuquerque-Bernalillo County Water Utility Authority and the Middle Rio Grande Conservancy District, to fund some forest restoration in critical basins of the upper Rio Grande. And so all of our process is really science-based. And so again, similar to the Forest Action Plan, early on in the Water Fund days, we developed a strategy for identifying those key basins where we want to do restoration work. And then, just as Laura described, we've updated that with the new Forest Action Plan. So we again are looking at these high priority basins within the Rio Grande, larger geography, and really focusing in on those. And to date, we're 6 years into the Water Fund, and we've supported directly 40 different projects, including the collaborative work that is really what gets the stuff from conception down to the ground, from ideas down into implementation. And so you can see a handful of our collaborative groups there outlined in this like orange triangle dot thing. But that's really what makes the world work. And we're connected with multiple partners. So really proud of this. We have 90 signatories that we're working with, and these vary from state agencies to federal agencies to tribes, non-governmental organizations, businesses, really span the gamut. And we're working at multiple scales. And so someone asked the question earlier, how do you get involved? And I think that we have multiple different pathways through the Water Fund to engage, whether you want to engage at the highest level or kind of dig down into the weeds at a local collaborative. We have opportunities for people to participate. And again, just kind of summing up some of the successes since the launch. And we don't do any of this without partnership. And so 140,000 acres are treated. And so we're getting to the point where our restoration activities, because they're strategically placed, because they're focused, because collaboratives hold people accountable, we're actually able to increase the pace and scale that approaches something that matches the scale of the disturbances and the challenges that we're facing. And we've got, 140,000 acres treated, but almost twice that in the planning pipeline. So more acres to come that will allow for quick investment of whether it's state or federal or private money to go right into on the ground restoration. And all the time we're doing this, we're creating jobs and we're supporting local economy. And so we think that, as we sort of enter into the economic uncertainties of the next year, the restoration economy in New Mexico has an opportunity to play a really critical role. And the greatest nexus between, in my opinion, the greatest nexus between water, forests, and fire is beer. And for the second year in a row, Second Street Brewery has been, our neighbors in Santa Fe have been kind enough to brew a beer that is supportive of forest restoration. So if you're out in Santa Fe or at a Whole Foods around the state, I think you can pick some of these things up still. And a great way to support a local business and show your support for forest restoration. We don't get any money for this, but it's just a good outreach opportunity for us. And again, for those who are interested, if you want to sign up and join our mailing list, I think that thing should work if you want to scan it. Otherwise, you can go to riograndwaterfund.org. And we have an annual meeting, signatories meeting, and then we kind of do things periodically throughout the year. So with that, I will open it up to any kind of questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Collin. Anybody have any questions? I'll kick it off with one. I know I've heard Laura speak in the past about kind of an evolution of the mechanisms to make these collaboratives function from a financial point of view. And I remember hearing that the initial Santa Fe initiative used a tax mechanism to gather funds, but the Rio Grande project has really used more of a charity mechanism. And I was just wondering if you had any thoughts about that, any discussion of, because there's a lot of different ways that ecosystem service payment kind of, ideas work. Some people trade, there's incentives, and just wondering if you had any insights over the last little while.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, right now the Rio Grande Water Fund is completely voluntary, and so we're not. There's no discussion about trying to put a bond together or a tax together. We just use discretionary funds from the Water Authority and from the Conservancy districts, and then our other partners, whether they're federal or foundations, provide funding either for the water fund, it's, just general operations of the water fund, or contribute to specific projects. And really, we've used that model pretty successfully. And I think as we start to think, like looking towards the future, one of the biggest limiting factors is federal grant match funding. And so what I'm hoping we can do is find a way to encourage non-federal contributions to the water fund that can be tied to federal funds that can then leverage, continue to leverage, either depending on the funding source, 5-to-1, or just that providing that 1-to-1 match, which is so critical to bring in some of those federal dollars into the state. And I think that just, that increases our sort of the selling points, and saying your dollar goes further, you're able to contribute more. We turn your dollar into, at least $2, if not $5. And hoping, as we work with our district foresters at state forestry and things like that, hoping to tap into some of the their wealth of knowledge in terms of the other funding sources. So part of what we do is also kind of that matchmaking between fund source and project.
Terrific. I see a comment thanking you. Great to hear about all your projects from Lily Conrad. Any other questions before we turn it over to Zach Libbin? I see that Mark Sheely just put, you can sign up for the Rio Grande Water Fund emails here. He put a link in the chat.
Thanks, Mark. Appreciate that.
All right, Collin, thank you so much. We will now turn back to Southern New Mexico, and Zach Libbin, who is the district engineer for the Elephant Butte Irrigation District and the co-chair of the South Central New Mexico Stormwater Management Coalition, which we basically just call the Stormwater Coalition. So Zach, take it away.
Good afternoon. I'm trying to get my screen to share. Can you see that?
Yes.
Good afternoon. As Connie said, my name is Zach Libbin. I'm the district engineer for the Elephant Butte Irrigation District for EBID. As she said, I'm also the co-chair of the Stormwater Coalition. And I'm also the chair of the steering committee for the New Mexico Watershed and Dam Owners Coalition. Stepping in for John Gwynn today, who had an emergency. John is the chair of the Stormwater Coalition. And today I'll be speaking specifically from that view of the Stormwater Coalition. And I'll try not to let John down. And I'll also thank Connie for the beautiful graphics in this slideshow. So the Stormwater Coalition was officially formed by a joint powers agreement. Work was done long in advance of that, somewhat by a different name. With the formalized in 2011 with a joint powers agreement between the Doñana County Flood Commission, the Village of Hatch, EBID, the Doñana Soil and Water Conservation District, Caballo Soil and Water Conservation District, Sierra Soil and Water Conservation District, Sierra County Flood Commission, and the City of Anthony. As the quote on that previous slide said, it's sort of came from a recognition that stormwater, and any water specifically, but stormwater doesn't respect political boundaries. So it became apparent that we needed an approach that could serve a regional watershed management approach. And so when you're looking at flooding is somewhat obvious part of stormwater. Erosion is harder to see. The goal of the Stormwater Coalition became to plan and manage all of these efforts to plan and manage the watersheds more regionally. John Gwynn has a quote there on the left. that we've changed from our philosophy from trying to capture and hold stormwater to trying to slow it down in the watersheds and infiltrate it where we can. And I think, well, as I said, erosion is hard to see, and sediment and silt are also very hard to deal with. Definitely a significant problem for EBID and the Flood Commission and the International Boundary and Water Commission, who manage the river. For the Flood Commission, using one of their examples, flood control dams that they manage, they can spend significant money to address sediment that's collected behind the dam to restore some of the capacity of that dam, just to see it fill up in the next couple of years, because it's always an ongoing issue. So these stormwater issues can also be an opportunity, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, but in times of drought and severely limited supply, stormwater is also an opportunity for a portion of our supply from the view of the EBID, and then the water, including the aquifer, including the entire system, the whole water system. So the Stormwater Coalition started out addressing mostly communication and collaboration, working to define some goals and talk about regional flood control and the more regional issues. We've moved on to, so that's still our primary focus, but moved on to trying to implement some projects as well. The biggest one being the Rincon Arroyo watershed that Connie's already talked about, and I'll talk about some more as well, that we selected as a priority project. We could have started with a much smaller watershed, but the Rincon Arroyo watershed is a significant issue on a variety of different reasons, including sediment. The Rincon Arroyo brings an incredible amount of sediment into the river, making it one of the reasons that the EBID likes to focus on that as well, because the International Boundary and Water Commission struggles to maintain that much sediment that comes into the river. So again, looking at this strategy of the upper watershed restoration, all the way on down to the valley and the agroecology strategy, including the stormwater harvesting and sediment capture and aquifer recharge. So trying to slow the water down on the watershed and infiltrate that stormwater has downstream impacts. So the largest project that we have trying to get moving forward for the Rincon Arroyo is a watershed protection and flood prevention operations program project with the NRCS. They usually call that the Watersheds program, and there's a lot of potential for a watershed scale approach and watershed scale improvements. I've had with the Doñana County and the Doñana County Flood Commission as the primary recipient. The NRCS has started contracting for a planning effort to determine possibilities for working on that watershed and implementing some of these efforts that we're talking about here. So this is the larger funding opportunity. Again, planning has been funded so far, and the NRCS's programs they take a long time. So the wheels of progress turn slowly. We're gonna have to be patient with some of those. In the meantime, NMED Watershed Implementation Grant through their 319 Clean Water Act funds has awarded a smaller project, and so it's not a pilot. Instead, it's a smaller implementation project that we can learn from. Definitely help us with learning about how do we have some of these projects that we want to implement on a broader scale, how we can implement those. So all these watersheds, and similarly with the watersheds that Laura and Collin were talking about, these storms this runoff can have huge energy, and this high energy both turns into damaging flows, but also erosion and sediment yield. And so you can see there, when we're talking 14,000 CFS for a 25-year storm, that is a huge amount of water, and it has damaging effects. And this becomes the largest contributing sediment yield in the Hatchimassia valleys. A study that IBWC pursued, done by Tetra Tech, estimated 36.2 acre feet per year annual sediment yield. And so when we're looking at the fact that the IBWC didn't do maintenance for roughly 20 years, and now is trying to get back after that, and then we start talking about how many cubic yards of material that is that needs to get moved just to keep up with that annual yield, and then even think about trying to catch up. It's incredible. It's an incredible amount of sediment, and so the best way that we can deal with that is to try and keep that on the watershed. So we need to keep moving along here. Sorry. So this is, of course, a bit different from the forest and upper watershed issues, but in general, we end up with similar issues and trying to implement some similar techniques, somewhat softer engineering to find ways to slow this water down, spread it out. And when I'm talking about implementing project on the Rincon Arroyo watershed as an example, we're looking at many small scale flood control measures. And so that's tricky, and that's hard to explain to NRCS, for example, when they're mostly thinking about dams, and we're talking about hundreds of smaller measures to control that sediment. So a couple funding opportunities that we've applied for and have come our way are the first one is a cooperative watershed management program. The idea here is that the Bureau of Reclamation is supporting the Stormwater Coalition in getting the ball rolling on some larger efforts and getting a bit more organized. Another one, the next one is a drought response program funded by the Bureau of Reclamation with EBID as the primary sponsor for that. So this cooperative watershed management program is looking at a larger area and specifically supporting the Stormwater Coalition as the applicant, with the Jornada RC&D as a fiscal agent. So the largest issue faced, there are these degrading upper watersheds, and Connie had some great pictures of this in her primer. But just this erosion and sediment transport is incredible. And so some of those pictures that she showed where you're looking at cliffs of 20 feet that has just eroded, makes it no surprise where the sediment that's ending up in the river is coming from. So working on the watershed analysis, Connie is specifically, I should say, has worked on the watershed analysis and lessons from the Rincon Arroyo, and the idea would be to apply that to other watersheds in the Hatchimassia Valley, learning from that, the Rincon Arroyo. So we want to expand the early warning system and then talk more about lower watershed infrastructure to capture that sediment and trying to address water supply issues from those larger storms. Okay, so early warning is an effort that Doña Ana County Flood Commission and EBID are both taking, installing rain gauges and weather stations across the entire valleys and watersheds, just trying to get a handle on these storms when they're coming in, and how we can both be better prepared for flood control, as well as improving our data and our science for this erosion control efforts. So certainly no one is surprised, everyone here, no one is surprised to hear that we are in ongoing and persistent drought. These efforts of the Stormwater Coalition can also help us with increasing our water supply resiliency to drought. And so then this slide is just pointing out that we are coming up with opportunities and projects to improve some of these issues, maybe without lawyers and without so dependent on judges. So again, supporting Laura's call to action that the water and forest, we can also include our local Lower Rio Grande watersheds here too. So likewise, no one's surprised to hear that El Paso and Las Cruces are both growing, with El Paso growing towards Las Cruces and an over appropriated water supply. We need to be facing these water issues. So I don't have a lot to say about the planning efforts within the Organ Mountains National Monument, besides that some of us had concerns about the monument and wilderness designations within our watersheds, but now we need to find a way to come up with approaches that can work within those designations and still implement some of these efforts. I already mentioned this, the watershed scale stormwater capture efforts of the Stormwater Coalition with EBID as the primary sponsor. Then with a part of that is a design decision support tool being put together by WRRI. I can get wrapped up here for Connie. Again, the Stormwater Coalition is a regional effort to try and address these more local issues, but our call to action is still pretty similar. Specifically awareness about watersheds, both forested upper watersheds that Laura and Collin talked about, as well as these more local to southern New Mexico and watersheds that have faced desert conditions and certainly still need some attention. So with that, stand for any questions. I know we're out of time, Connie.
We are, but thank you, Zach. I think you can see there's quite a lot of issues down in our area. So if you have any questions, why don't you go ahead and post them in the chat and we'll try to respond to you. But I think we are out of time and we need to turn it over to Bob Saby and the desalination panel. So thank you everybody very much. Lots of things going on, watershed restoration in New Mexico, and a long way to go as of yet. Thank you.